Firstly, though, to problem gambling, there's been a few stories, a few issues on problem gambling, particularly online gambling, that have been taking the time and attention of the good people at the Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit of the Salvation Army. Senior Social Policy Analyst Paul Barber joins me on the program now. Paul, kia ora, good morning.
Yeah, Maury and Andrew, it's good to be here.
This is an area of focus for you guys. In particular, you see the consequences of problem gambling, the impact it has on families, particularly those that can least afford it. There's a number of irons in the fire on this one at the moment. Let's start with some proposed legislation changes to I suppose, increase opportunity for gambling, not online gambling, but sort of one-off lottery stuff. What's the situation there?
Yeah, look, it's a really complex world, the gambling world, and this is something that you learn when you try and engage with this to get some change. What had me in front of Parliament Select Committee last week was talking about a small change. In fact, one of the people there, lawyers there, commented it was the shortest bill they'd ever done in the Crown Law Office. It was a one-sentence bill to permanently change the Gambling Act, which is from 2003, to allow Class 3 lotteries, as they're called, to be done remotely, so they can be promoted and tickets sold and online. The Gambling Act doesn't actually allow those, and the Class 3 lotteries are those big lotteries run by people like the Heart Foundation and so on that are raising funds for charitable purposes. They're one-off, but they're large. They have a large prize money, and so they need a special permit from the Ministry of Internal Affairs. In themselves, but basically this law said, no problem here. It's not a harmful form of gambling, and we would agree that it's not in the most harmful form. Class 3 is not as harmful as the Class 4, which is the next level on pokies and casino gambling and so on. However, what awoke our concern and led us to make a very short submission and ask to talk to the Select Committee was to remind them that this is a form of online gambling, and we haven't regulated online gambling properly yet. In fact, we haven't regulated online gambling at all, really, and especially overseas offline gambling. So online gambling. So it links to that point there.
Online gambling, I suppose, is the latest one around, and you mentioned pokies beforehand. That does tremendous harm in our communities. But online gambling is the sort of thing that we haven't really measured the impact of this, and it looks like it's only going to grow. In particular, and again, I know this is something that you guys are looking at, online gambling from offshore casinos. I know the government's wanting to clip the ticket on this one to go, well, if people are spending money on offshore casinos online, we'd at least like to get the GST on that, thanks.
Indeed, what they're planning to introduce a duty on offshore online casinos. There must be an abbreviation. We can come up with that. Anyway, that will charge a 12% duty on the turnover on those casinos. However, that of course will require a whole process about recognizing that this gambling is then allowed, I guess, in this country. At the moment, it's an illegal vacuum, essentially, and that it will need to be regulated and controlled and harm minimization introduced. And this is where ourselves and the Problem Gambling Foundation and other organizations concerned with the public health impacts of gambling are really, we really want this to be done well. We want it to be done carefully, and it really shouldn't be rushed. It needs to be planned well. And it's going to be complicated because, obviously managing and access to anything online these days is tricky and needs constant attention because, there's always ways being found around things.
This is, in some ways, it's a good news, bad news, because it's good news, sort of, that the government is saying, hey, maybe we should regulate online gambling because, as you say, there's a bit of a vacuum in this regard. The problem, as I see it, though, is if this gets monetized, then there's not necessarily a government incentive to restrict it. If the government is clipping the ticket on this one, it's a little bit like some of the questions about, if the government's making so much money from cigarette sales, do they have a vested interest in not increasing the amount of, smoking cessation, as it were? Is this a concern that you have as well, that if the government monetizes it, then it becomes a revenue source and not necessarily seen for the harm it causes?
Absolutely. The alarm bells rang for us earlier when it was announced that we're going to introduce a levy on the online offshore casinos. But there was no mention of the harm minimization of the regulatory work that's needed around this. And so if it's primarily seen as a revenue raiser, then that's the wrong reason.
Yeah.
And I guess, though, this is a tension we have constantly with gambling. It is a harmful activity. There are tens of thousands of people affected either directly through gambling addictions of various forms, as well as their wider families and communities by the effects of gambling in this country. It's not a harmless activity. And there are various types of gambling that are more harmful, and continuous forms of gambling, such as the dreaded pokie machines, and the various types of online casinos are right up there as the most dangerous forms. So that means proceed with caution. And there are a whole set of things that we can do to make this, if we're going to go this way. I mean, as an organization where Salvation Army is not keen on, firstly, on this whole idea that gambling be used to fund good causes, so to speak, and we really, our first advocacy, and this is what I was telling the Select Committee last week, was we really want to see other sources of fundings other than people having to turn to running large lotteries, going to the pokey trusts for funding grants for their community activities. There should be an alternative source of funding that is not associated with gambling, and that the regulatory approach to gambling really should be removed from any of this window dressing, essentially. That it's, some of it goes to a good cause, and recognizing it's simply a harmful activity. There's a lot of risks of organized crime, money laundering, and other illegal activities that can be associated with it. So we need to be really tough on the regulation and look very much as a peripheral issue around that funding side, and importantly offer the opportunity for community groups to raise money in a different way.
This is a bit of a hard sell in some ways, though, as people possibly don't see the harm, and there'll be people listening to this who, quite happy to take part in a school raffle as a fundraiser, occasionally might get a lotto ticket. It's not a big deal for them. It's not causing a problem or a crisis in their life. So think, oh gosh, what harm does it do? Perhaps like people who think, gosh, alcohol isn't harmful. I have a drink twice a year and it hasn't hurt me. That there are some people who may be able to engage in things like gambling recreationally as a bit of fun, but don't see the dark underbelly of the industry.
Well, that's the issue. In many ways, it's seen as a sort of harmless form of entertainment. But and if you look at the way, for instance, people might see lotto and the scratchies, as being a harmless activity, yet actually about 12% of people have a harmful level of engagement with that. And again, it's not the most harmful. It definitely is the class 4 gambling and from pokie machines particularly, and in casinos. However, it is still, those things, it's not a harmless activity, and it can lead into addictive behaviors, and so you do need to do it carefully. So if you're engaging, you have to be mindful that a lot of the harm that's seen from gambling, and this is a message we hear again and again, is hidden. People are ashamed of what's happened to them. They don't want to admit it even to those close to them. They'll hide the impacts of gambling harm, and it's something that reaches across all levels of society. And I'm also involved in a reference group for a research project looking at the exposure of children to online gambling through their activities, for instance, on their phones and online.
Some of it's a blurry line between gaming and gambling, particularly for the young people, and this is, purposefully targeted at young people for those reasons, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think people need to be aware that that's often underlying motive behind some of the risk games that are
Yeah.
are marketed heavily to children and to adults as well. There's a whole world of gaming, and yes, it does cross over. There's a whole boundary thing to be explored around that, and we are really struggling to catch up in a regulatory fashion
Yeah.
and in a social management fashion with the innovations that happen online, the things that happen online. Um, but we come back to that perspective. Well, we actually have a law that says we want to prevent gambling harm
Hmm.
and prevent and minimize it. That is one of the primary goals of the law that makes any of these forms of gambling legal. You need to think about what if we were prioritizing that prevention approach. We'd be really strict about how you access things. We'd be really strict about putting limits, so you can self-limit. You can say to yourself, okay, I want to have a flutter. I can afford $50 or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And I'll be required as I enter the game to restrict my game. If I feel I'm having a problem, I can self-exclude, and how can you do that in an online setting? How can
Yeah.
you ensure that when something pops up? How can you ensure that the advertising, which is really pervasive? I mean, anyone who's watched
Oh, yeah.
anything, the rugby on TV, will
Yeah.
see that how the TAB betting on that is promoted. How do we regulate that? Because that again, people of all ages see that sort of advertising. So there's a wide range of things we need to do, and we need to do it carefully and do it well. And do it. We're strongly arguing to take a really careful approach to this.
One of
It's
the other one of the other challenges, I suppose, and I know that there is a report on problem gambling coming up for the Ministry of Health, but it's not all in one bucket. I suppose there's kind of like a three-legged stool in terms of the problem gambling. That's Ministry of Health. In terms of the regulations, that's a different government department, and then revenue gathering is a third. Having a government policy that deals with gambling as a whole, rather than it being knocked from one government department to another, that's part of the problem?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think we have the Gambling Act deliberately was set up to ensure that the public health is funded in a way that is separate. I mean, we only spend $25 million a year on gambling harm minimization and prevention.
Yeah.
That's 1% of all the profits from class, for the current forms of gambling, 2.7 billion.
Wow.
It's probably likely that online gambling is somewhere up there with around the amount that's official onshore physical casino gambling. So it's right up there as one of the larger activities. That gambling needs to contribute to that public harm reduction, because we're going to public health, the harm reduction work by public health.
Mm.
It's good to have the regulators in a separate space, because their job is just to focus on getting things right.
Okay.
They do need to be governed by, however, coherent regulation and policy. Yeah, and the Ministry of Health is actually consulting on the prevention of and minimization of gambling harm strategy that they do every 3 years right now. And that's been another reason, while I've been thinking a lot about gambling, is that submissions are due this week. And that strategy sets things like where money will be spent to help try and prevent gambling. And if I look at what's happened over 20 years in the battle to reduce gambling harm, the Salvation Army actually spent our Oasis services were actually ceased in January this year. Their funding contract was ended.
Mm-hmm.
However, we continue as an organization to see the effects of gambling everywhere and continue to be concerned about this issue. But if you look back over those sort of 30 years, what we've done is we opened the Pandora's box of high harmful forms of gambling,
Yep.
attempted to regulate them. And we've spent the last 15, 20 years trying to reduce access, reduce harm, reduce the damage that's caused.
Mm.
We've had, when I look at the statistics, the prevalence of, how frequently people are hurt by gambling, or what they call the prevalence,
Yep.
hasn't really changed. But what we've had is a whole lot of these regulatory and public health measures to reduce the amount of gambling that's going on, and actually on a per capita basis, the amount of gambling that happens has dropped.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks like it's probably the moderate, as a whole, there's less participation in gambling by people in the wider public than there was 10 years ago.
Which is good news.
Yeah, which is good news, and shows that some of these measures work. They've reduced access to gambling, and people have said, it's not worth it, or I don't see it, and I don't think of even doing it.
Yeah.
However, the real issue is that the problem gambling harm, we haven't been able to really further reduce that, and that is, I guess, the big concern, that if we don't carry on being really strict in our controls, we'll see that harm rise.
Particularly with online gambling. And just wanted to get your comments finally on whether or not things get tougher in economic times, because I know particularly for people who are facing some tough financial times, who are finding it difficult to hold on to hope in some areas of their life, that sometimes gambling can be an easy out. Sometimes the only hope that they have is, gosh, what if I win lotto? Or what if I take the smaller money that I have? Maybe I could double it by gambling. Is there a causal effect in terms of your research and with the help that you provide in the community? In tough financial times, do people who have a gambling problem tend to gamble more?
I'm not sure that I can say they tend to gamble more, but it certainly does them more harm if your income is reduced, if you're in tougher circumstances, and any of our financial mentors would tell you that this is one of the issues for people. If you're spending money on one thing that isn't about those essentials like food and rent, then you're on a tight income, you're in trouble. And we have to remember that, again, one of the public harm, most harmful forms of gambling are concentrated in the poorest communities and the more deprived communities, and so you've got a double whammy of being more exposed to the temptation or to do involve in gambling, and more at risk of being harmed by it, because financially you really don't have as much room to move to be able to afford the losses. So yes, and one of the things that has been quite reasonably successful has been reducing access to pokies. For instance, the number of pokies has dropped by 30% the last 10 years, and there is a reduction, but they're mostly in those poorer communities. But the number in those communities has been reducing, so we have seen successes again in reducing that access, and that reduces that harm. But I guess the overall message is, if something is really being heavily marketed to you, promoted to you everywhere you go, when you look on your phone, you watch TV, you go down to the shop, it's promoted to you, your chances of winning are pretty minimal. Is that really a good choice to make? And we really should be supporting people to make good choices for themselves, their families, and their communities.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you do, both in terms of research and advocacy, and also supporting people who do struggle with problem gambling. Salvationarmy.org.nz, of course, for more information. But Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your time today, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.